The Widow Who Spoke to the Dead. Leave a like and write in the comments which part of the world you're listening to this story from. Let's begin. The town of Red Hollow was built around a mistake. No one said that aloud, of course. On the frontier, survival depended on convincing yourself that every choice had been necessary, every loss unavoidable. But the land remembered differently. It remembered the bodies buried without names. It remembered the deals signed under pressure and the shots fired too quickly in the dark. And at the center of it all stood a woman whom the town preferred not to look at for too long. Her name was Margaret Hale. She lived at the far end of Red Hollow, where the dirt road narrowed and the desert began to reclaim what the town had borrowed from it. Her house was small, weather-beaten, and deliberately plain, as if she had chosen not to invite attention. Yet attention found her anyway. It always did, because Margaret Hale was a widow, and widows on the frontier carried a particular kind of gravity, especially when their husbands had died violently. Elias Hale had been the town's undertaker. He knew how to prepare bodies, how to close eyes gently, how to set hands in prayer even when the dead had never believed. He knew secrets no living man should have known: bullet trajectories, knife wounds disguised as accidents, the weight of a body that had been dead too long before discovery. And when he died suddenly one winter night, Red Hollow felt the loss like a tooth pulled too quickly. Margaret did not cry in public. She buried her husband herself, insisting on closing the coffin alone. Those who watched from a distance swore they heard her speaking softly into the ground afterward, her words carried away by the wind before anyone could understand them. After that night, strange things began to happen. The dead stopped staying silent. It started with sounds. At first, it was nothing more than a knock heard late at night, 3 slow taps on the inside of a wall. Then came the whispers, carried through the floorboards of the saloon and the church alike. Men woke with the sense that someone had spoken their name just before dawn. Women found dirt beneath their fingernails after dreams they could not remember. And always, the sounds led back to Margaret Hale's house. She did not deny it when asked. "They talk," she said simply, her voice steady, "and I listen." That was enough to mark her. The sheriff warned her gently. The preacher prayed louder near her pew. Children were told not to linger near her fence. Yet no one dared confront her outright, because the dead had begun to tell stories, and too many of those stories involved people still living in Red Hollow. Margaret did not seek power. It came to her anyway. Each night, she lit a single lamp and sat at her kitchen table, hands folded, eyes closed. She did not chant. She did not summon. She waited. And when the dead arrived, they did so not as apparitions, but as pressure in the air, as cold settling into the bones, as memories forced back into the world through breath and word. They told her how they had died. They told her who had lied. They told her what had been taken from them, and Margaret listened because she loved her husband, and because he had taught her that the dead only become dangerous when ignored. The town would learn that lesson soon enough. Red Hollow tried, at first, to pretend nothing had changed. Men still gathered at the saloon after sundown, boots thudding against the warped boards, cards slapped onto tables with practiced ease. The church bell still rang on Sundays, its dull echo rolling across the scrubland and dissolving into the hills. Wagons still arrived, unloaded and departed. Life, on the surface, carried on, but underneath, the town had become porous. Secrets no longer stayed buried. Words spoken in confidence slipped loose. Guilt began to surface in small, inconvenient ways. A man would wake convinced he had confessed something aloud, only to realize his mouth had never opened. Another would feel hands on his shoulders in empty rooms, gentle but insistent, urging him to remember something he had spent years forgetting. Margaret Hale became the axis around which all of this turned. She did not leave her property often anymore, but people came to her. At first, they arrived under cover of darkness, hats pulled low, knocking softly as if afraid the house itself might overhear them. They did not ask her to summon the dead. They asked instead if she had heard anything, if any names had been spoken, if their own had come up. Margaret answered honestly. Sometimes she said yes. Sometimes she said nothing at all. That silence was worse. The dead came to her in layers. The newest arrivals were always the loudest. Confused, frightened, still clinging to the shape of their bodies. They spoke of sudden violence, of accidents that were not accidents, of final moments filled with disbelief. Margaret learned to sit through their panic without absorbing it, to let their stories pass through her like wind through dry grass. The older dead were quieter. They spoke slowly, carefully, as if each word required effort. These were the ones who had been buried improperly, forgotten, denied rights or remembrance. They carried not rage, but endurance. Their stories were not accusations so much as records, facts placed gently but firmly back into the world. It was from them that Margaret learned the true history of Red Hollow. The land had been taken in stages, first through persuasion, then through pressure, finally through force disguised as inevitability. Families pushed out after suspicious fires, men accused of crimes that conveniently removed them from contested claims, women silenced by reputation rather than rope. Elias Hale, her husband, had known many of these truths. As undertaker, he had seen the marks on bodies that contradicted official stories. He had kept quiet to survive. Now he spoke to Margaret every night, not as a ghost with form or face, but as a presence she felt behind her left shoulder, familiar and steady. He never accused her of anything. He never begged. He simply reminded her of what he had carried alone for too long. "You don't have to carry it all," she whispered once, tears slipping down her cheeks. But the dead did not answer that way. They came because she listened. And listening, she learned, was an act with consequences. The first death that followed her widowhood was not mysterious. A rancher named Thomas Breck collapsed in the street one afternoon, clutching his chest, eyes wide with something that looked like recognition rather than fear. He died before anyone reached him. That night, he came to Margaret, angry, loud, demanding to know why she had not warned him. "You knew," he accused. "You heard my name." Margaret met his fury without flinching. "I heard what you did," she said, "not what would happen." His voice faltered then, thinning like mist. He remembered the man he had shot years earlier over a fence line, the way the body had been dragged and buried without marker, the lie he had repeated until it became habit. By morning, half the town knew, not because Margaret spoke, but because the truth had found cracks everywhere. Thomas Breck's son left Red Hollow within a week. Others followed, sensing the balance shifting beneath their feet. The sheriff confronted Margaret soon after. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, his posture rigid with the strain of authority tested too often. "People are afraid," he said. Margaret nodded. "They should be." "That's not an answer," he replied. "It's the only honest one," she said quietly. The sheriff looked past her, toward the dim interior of the house. He swallowed. "Are you calling them the dead?" "No," Margaret said. "They come." "Why you?" Margaret considered the question. Then she answered with the truth that had taken root in her bones. "Because I loved someone who listened to them, and because I stayed." That night, the ground beneath Red Hollow shifted, not violently, subtly. Wells produced cloudy water for the first time. Horses refused to cross certain stretches of road. The cemetery gate swung open, despite being chained. The dead were no longer content to speak through Margaret alone. They began leaving signs, objects misplaced, names scratched into wood, dreams shared by people who had never known one another. The town stood at the edge of a reckoning it could no longer avoid. and Margaret Hale, widow of the undertaker, sat at her table beneath a single lamp, listening as the dead prepared to speak not just to her, but to everyone. The first time the dead spoke to someone other than Margaret, it happened in the saloon, because Red Hollow's sins had always preferred to sit among whiskey, laughter, and denial. It was a Thursday night, the kind that felt ordinary enough to make men careless. Cards were down, a bottle was half empty, and a few ranch hands were telling the same story they always told about a storm that nearly took their herd. The piano player, an old man with fingers stiff from cold, was working through a slow tune when the sound changed, not in volume, but in texture. The notes began to drag, as if the air had thickened around them. Then the keys depressed on their own. Everyone saw it. The piano continued playing, though no hands touched it. The melody was wrong, broken in places, repeating a phrase like a question asked too many times without an answer. A few men laughed nervously, convinced it was a trick. One leaned forward to inspect the bench and froze when he saw the faint wetness on the wood, fresh water, beading as if a soaked body had just stood there. The saloon door swung open. No one entered, the lanterns dimmed, and in the sudden hush, a voice, thin, distant, layered with the sound of dirt shifting, spoke one name: Caldwell. Silence hit the room like a physical thing. Heads turned toward Calvin Caldwell, a respected man in town, the owner of 2 freight wagons and a small patch of land he guarded like it was sacred. He sat stiff, his face paling, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The voice spoke again, closer now, as if leaning down into the space between tables. "You left me there." Calvin's chair scraped back. He stood, his hand hovering near his belt, not ready to draw, not sure what weapon could do in a room where air itself had learned to speak. His eyes flicked around the saloon wildly, searching for a human source of the accusation. He found none. Then, softly at first, unmistakably, men began hearing the same thing in their own heads, the sound of digging, slow, desperate. Fingernails against dry soil, a muffled cough, a final breath swallowed by earth. Calvin gagged, bent forward, and vomited onto the floor. No one moved to help him. Not out of cruelty, but because help felt impossible in the face of something so precise. The dead weren't haunting the saloon at random. They weren't looking for attention. They were calling accounts due. Calvin stumbled out into the night, pushing past the swinging doors. Several men followed, not to comfort him, but to see what would happen next, because the frontier had always bred a terrible curiosity. Outside, fog clung low to the street, and the sound of the river seemed louder than it should, though it lay a mile away. Calvin walked as if dragged by a chain only he could feel, heading toward the edge of town, toward the dry scrub, where nothing grew thick enough to hide a grave. His boots sank into damp soil that shouldn't have been damp. His breath came in ragged, panicked pulls. "Stop!" the sheriff barked, hurrying after him. Sheriff Malloy was a broad man with tired eyes, the kind that had watched too many disputes turn violent. He caught Calvin's shoulder. "You're in shock. You need—" Calvin twisted free with surprising strength. "Don't touch me," he snarled, voice cracking. "You don't understand." Malloy's jaw tightened. "Then tell me." Calvin's lips trembled. His eyes flooded with tears that looked less like grief and more like terror. He stared past the sheriff into the fog, as if seeing a figure that stood just outside human sight. "I didn't mean," he whispered. "It was supposed to be quick." The sheriff's voice lowered. "Who?" Calvin swallowed hard, throat bobbing. "A boy, not even a man." He tried to take the freight ledger. Said it proved something, said it showed where the money went. Malloy's expression changed, going still in the way a man goes still when he recognizes the shape of a truth he's avoided. "And you killed him." Calvin shook his head violently. "I didn't shoot him. I hit him. He fell. He wasn't moving right. I panicked." His breath hitched. "I buried him. I thought—" He swallowed, eyes wide. "I thought I could keep him quiet." Behind them, The town held its breath. A dog began to whine somewhere down the street, then fell silent as if choked off by something unseen. The fog moved, sliding in a slow arc around the gathered men, forming a clear pocket of air like a stage prepared for confession. Malloy's voice was hard now. "Where?" Calvin's shoulders sagged. He pointed with a trembling hand toward the scrubland beyond the last houses. "There, by the old limestone outcrop." I stacked stones. I told myself it was enough. The sheriff exhaled slowly, as if the air itself tasted bitter. He looked around at the men who had followed, faces pale, eyes fixed, mouths tight. "Go home," he told them, "all of you." No one obeyed, not because they were brave, but because they were trapped in the gravity of what had begun. Red Hollow had always relied on a shared agreement. Keep the past buried, and the present stays manageable. That agreement had been broken, not by Margaret, but by the dead deciding they were tired of being convenient. Calvin started walking again. This time, Malloy did not stop him. He followed, lantern in hand, along with a reluctant line of townsmen who felt they had no choice but to witness. They moved beyond the last fence posts, into land that smelled of damp stone and old river silt. The fog thinned out there, but the cold grew sharper, biting at knuckles, settling behind ears. At the limestone outcrop, Calvin dropped to his knees. He clawed at the ground like a man possessed. Dirt scraped beneath his nails. He dug faster and faster, sobbing, muttering words that sounded like prayers and curses tangled together. When his fingers struck something hard, he froze. Then he began pulling stones away, revealing a shallow grave lined with stacked rock. The smell hit first: earth, rot, and something faintly metallic. Calvin recoiled, covering his mouth. The sheriff held the lantern steady, face rigid, eyes locked on what lay beneath the stones. A small skeleton wrapped in decayed cloth, the remains of a boy's shirt still clinging in places. The skull's jaw hung open as if caught mid-sentence. Malloy's voice came out hoarse. "Guard!" Then, in the stillness, a whisper rose, not from the air, but from within the circle of men. A voice each of them seemed to hear inside their own bones. "He left me here." Calvin collapsed forward, forehead pressing into dirt. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." The whisper sharpened, not cruel but exact. "Say my name." Calvin's shoulders shook violently. His mouth worked. He swallowed, then forced the words out like splinters. "Jonah!" he gasped. "Jonah Rook!" The moment the name was spoken, the fog shifted. The cold eased by a fraction. The lantern flame steadied. Several men exhaled at once without realizing they'd been holding their breath. Malloy straightened slowly. His face looked older in the lantern light. He stared at the grave, then at Calvin, then at the line of silent townsmen, and he understood something he did not want to understand. This was only the beginning. Because a boy buried wrong was not the only secret Red Hollow had hidden, and now the dead had tasted what it felt like to be named again. They would not stop. That same night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table beneath her single lamp. She did not need to be told what had happened. She felt it as a shift in pressure, as a loosening in the air, as if a door that had been stuck for years had finally opened. Elias's presence settled behind her shoulder, heavy with relief. "They heard him," Margaret whispered, and though no voice answered aloud, she felt the truth in her bones. The dead were no longer content to speak through one widow in one small house. They had found a crack in the town's silence. Now they would widen it, one name at a time, until Red Hollow either broke or became something it had never been. Honest. The lamp flame flickered once, then steadied. Outside, the fog began to move, not aimlessly but with purpose, rolling toward town as if the river itself had decided to walk. The next days unfolded like a long-held breath finally released. Red Hollow did not descend into chaos, not immediately. Instead, it entered a phase far more unsettling: attentiveness. People listened to their surroundings in ways they never had before. Floorboards were no longer ignored. Wind at night was no longer dismissed as weather. Every sound carried the possibility of intention. Sleep became unreliable. Men dreamed of hands reaching up from shallow graves. Women dreamed of voices calling from behind locked doors. Children woke crying, insisting someone had sat at the foot of their beds and asked them questions they did not know how to answer. The dead were not violent in these visitations. They were persistent. They wanted recognition, not revenge. Sheriff Malloy convened a meeting in the church. It was the only building large enough to hold the crowd, and even there, people pressed close together, filling the pews, standing along the walls. The air was thick with sweat and unease. Malloy stood at the pulpit, hat in his hands, his authority suddenly fragile. "We can't go on like this," he said. "We need order." A voice rose from the back. "Order for who?" Murmurs followed. Heads turned. Malloy tightened his grip on his hat. "For everyone." Another voice, sharper now. "You knew about Caldwell." Malloy did not deny it. Silence became his answer, and that silence spoke volumes. The dead had not just exposed individual crimes. They had illuminated the web of quiet complicity that bound the town together. Margaret did not attend the meeting. She sat at home, listening. The dead were louder now, but less frantic. They spoke in turns, as if some unspoken rule had emerged among them. She heard women first, voices edged with exhaustion rather than fury. They spoke of bruises explained away as clumsiness, of property signed over under threat, of disappearances no one investigated because the missing were inconvenient. Then came the men. Some spoke with bitterness, others with shame so deep it distorted their words. A few tried to justify themselves even in death, clinging to the same excuses that had failed them in life. Margaret listened to all of it. She did not argue. The dead did not need correction. They needed acknowledgement. Her body began to suffer. Listening took a toll. Headaches settled behind her eyes, dull and persistent. Her hands trembled when she poured water. Food lost its taste. The boundary between her thoughts and the dead's memories blurred, leaving her exhausted in ways sleep did not cure. Elias grew stronger, not in presence, but in clarity. His voice came through more distinctly now, less like an echo and more like conversation. He guided her gently when the dead crowded too close, reminding her to breathe, to ground herself in the physical world. It was a strange reversal, the living woman sustained by the dead man she had loved. One evening, Sheriff Malloy came to her door. He looked smaller without his badge catching the light, like a man stripped down to the weight of his choices. He did not knock loudly. He waited until she opened the door herself. "They won't stop," he said without preamble. "No," Margaret replied. "They won't." Malloy hesitated. "Can you ask them to?" Margaret studied him carefully. "Would you listen if they did?" He swallowed. "I don't know." "That's your answer," she said. Malloy closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, there was resignation there, not fear, not anger, but the acceptance of a man realizing he had been standing in the wrong place for a very long time. "What do they want?" he asked. Margaret stepped aside, letting him see the lamp-lit table, the empty chair across from her. "They want their names spoken, their stories told, and they want the living to stop pretending." Malloy exhaled. "That will tear this town apart. Or," Margaret said softly, "it will rebuild it on something real." The first trial in Red Hollow's history began a week later, not sanctioned by any higher authority, not recognized beyond the valley. But it happened anyway because too many people knew too much now to turn back. Evidence surfaced, ledgers, letters, buried remains. Confessions were offered voluntarily, some extracted by the unbearable pressure of being known by the dead. Not everyone survived the reckoning. 2 men fled town and were never seen again. One was found months later near the river, drowned under circumstances no one could quite explain. Another simply vanished, leaving behind a house that no one would enter. Margaret watched it all from a distance. She did not judge who stayed and who left. She did not intervene unless asked. Her role was not to direct justice, but to ensure it was no longer avoided. The dead guided the process now, their voices woven into dreams, into sudden recollections, into the unbearable quiet that followed lies. Red Hollow began to change its habits. People spoke more carefully, disputes were settled earlier, before resentment calcified into something dangerous. Graves were marked properly, names were spoken aloud on anniversaries. The dead did not fade, but they softened, their urgency replaced by something like watchfulness. Margaret aged quickly during those years. Lines etched themselves deep around her eyes, her hair silvered faster than it should have. She bore the marks of someone who had carried more than one life's worth of memory, yet she did not regret it. When the dead receded enough for silence to return, she felt lighter than she had since Elias's death. One night, long after the town had settled into its new shape, she heard a different kind of quiet, no whispers, no pressure, just stillness. Elias's presence faded gently, like a hand releasing hers. "You did it," he said. Margaret smiled through tears. "We did." Outside, the fog lifted completely for the first time in memory, revealing the stars sharp and bright over Red Hollow. The river flowed without sound. The land, at last, seemed to rest. But stories like this never truly end. They settle. And this one settled into the land itself, where it would remain as long as there were people willing to remember why the dead once spoke in Red Hollow, and why, after being heard, they finally allowed the living to go on in peace. Years later, travelers passing through Red Hollow noticed something difficult to put into words. The town felt deliberate. It was not prosperous in the way boomtowns were, nor desolate like places abandoned by fortune. It existed in a careful middle ground, where buildings were maintained without excess and people spoke with a measured patience uncommon on the frontier. Arguments still happened, but they ended sooner. Violence still occurred, but rarely without witnesses and never without memory. Graves were kept clean. Names were spoken aloud. Margaret Hale lived long enough to see children born who had never heard the dead speak for themselves. To them, the stories sounded exaggerated, like campfire warnings told by elders who remembered a harsher world. Margaret never corrected them. She understood that each generation needed distance to survive, yet the land never forgot. There were places outside town where grass refused to grow, spots where horses shied and wagons slowed without reason. Travelers who camped near the limestone outcrop sometimes woke with dirt under their nails and the sense that someone had been guiding their hands in sleep. No harm came to them, but they never stayed long. Margaret became a story herself. Some said she had been cursed by her husband's work. Others claimed she had been chosen. A few whispered that she had made a bargain. The truth, as always, was quieter. She had listened when listening was dangerous, and stayed when leaving would have been easier. In her final years, she no longer heard the dead as voices. Instead, they came as impressions, memories drifting through her thoughts like leaves on water. She could walk through town and sense where a lie had once lived, where a truth had nearly been lost. The weight of it no longer crushed her. It informed her. When she died, it was without ceremony. No visions, no whispers, no last confession demanded. She passed in her sleep, hands folded loosely over her chest, expression calm. The town buried her near Elias, not as penance or romance, but as acknowledgement, two lives intertwined by responsibility more than fate. After her death, Red Hollow did not unravel. That was the final proof. The dead did not return to speak through others. The land did not grow restless again. Silence held, but it was a different silence now, one that felt earned rather than enforced, the kind that allows breath. Decades later, when the railroad finally bypassed the town, Red Hollow shrank but did not disappear. Those who remained were not those who lacked options, but those who valued what the place had become, a town that knew its own shadow and chose not to run from it. Old men told the story on porches at dusk. They spoke of a widow who listened to the dead, not to control them, but to give them back their names. They spoke of a time when the land itself demanded honesty, and of how painful and necessary that demand had been. Children asked if the dead would ever speak again. The elders answered carefully. "They will," they said, "if we stop listening." And so the story endured, not as a haunting, not as a warning carved in fear, but as a reminder stitched quietly into the fabric of the place. Somewhere beneath the soil, beneath bone and memory and time, the dead rested, not erased, not forgiven, but acknowledged. And Red Hollow remained standing, not because it was innocent, but because it remembered. In the decades that followed, Red Hollow slipped quietly out of the maps most people used. It was not abandoned, but it was no longer pursued. The railroad chose easier ground. Merchants favored louder towns. Those who arrived now did so by accident or intention, never by chance. The road leading in narrowed until it felt less like an invitation and more like a test. Those who passed through felt it immediately. Not fear, not dread. Awareness. People lowered their voices without realizing why. They found themselves thinking before speaking, recalling old arguments they had never settled, names they had not spoken aloud in years. Some turned back before reaching the center of town, unsettled by the sensation that the place knew them too well. Others stayed. They stayed because something in Red Hollow offered a rare thing on the frontier: permission to be honest without spectacle. Margaret Hale's house remained standing long after her death. It was not preserved as a shrine, nor was it claimed by any authority. It simply endured, weathered and plain, its windows often dark. Travelers who asked about it were told gently that no one lived there now, but that the house did not like strangers who treated it as a curiosity. Inside, the lamp still sat on the kitchen table. No one remembered who had last lit it. The cemetery grew. Each grave was marked, each name spoken aloud at burial. The town developed an unspoken rule. No one was laid to rest without at least one person willing to say who they had been, not just how they had died. This practice spread outward, carried by families who left Red Hollow and found themselves unable to return to old habits of silence. Every few years, someone claimed to hear something at night, a voice, distant and indistinct, a knock that faded before a door could be opened. A dream so vivid it lingered for days, but these moments were different from before. They were not demands, they were reminders, gentle taps on memory's shoulder, and always they stopped once acknowledged. Old Sheriff Malloy died with his badge folded carefully beside him. In his will, he left a single instruction, that his failures be spoken aloud before his accomplishments. The town honored it. People listened. Some cried. No one argued. The land accepted him. Time smoothed the sharp edges of the story, but never erased it. Children born long after Margaret's death learned her name alongside the town's founding date. They were taught not as legend, but as history, imperfect, human, consequential. Teachers did not embellish, they did not frighten, they explained. Once, a boy asked if Margaret had been afraid. The teacher paused, then answered honestly, yes, but she stayed anyway. That answer followed the boy into adulthood. On certain nights, particularly when the river ran high and fog pressed low against the hills, people claimed the town felt fuller, not crowded, but accompanied, as if something unseen walked the streets alongside them, not watching, not judging, simply present. Those nights passed without incident. No one died unexpectedly. No objects moved. No names were called aloud. The dead had said what they needed to say. They had been heard, and because of that, Red Hollow was allowed a future, quiet, limited, imperfect, but real. The story did not end with a curse lifted or a miracle granted. It ended with something far rarer. A community that learned listening could be an act of survival. A land that stopped demanding blood in exchange for silence. And a widow whose love for her husband, for the truth, for the living and the dead alike, changed the shape of a place without ever raising her voice. If you stand at the edge of Red Hollow at dusk, when the sky dims and the air cools, you may feel it, not a presence, a balance. And that balance remains as long as someone, somewhere, remembers why the dead once spoke, and why they no longer need to.